Good morning. Welcome back. We are Burning Bridge, Ranger's Apprentice Book 2. The sun is shining. I'm going to deal with it because I like the sun. We last left them, Horace, Will, and Galan ended up at Celtica, that garrison. Remember the security post? And then they went into the village I can't remember what the name of that was called. Something like Pendamoth, or I don't remember. Kind of scanning through. This is what I do when I read, though. I like to get an idea when I come back to it. Oh, Portalath. So they are going to go investigate and figure out. And I asked you guys, what do you think happened to these people? And now we're flipping back chapter by chapter between the castle, and the war preparations, and then Will, Horace, and Galan. Into his own moat, you say? Said Sir Rodney. He paused to think about the fact. Lady Pauline noticed that he didn't seem overly shocked by Halt's action. If anything, there was a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The Baron frowned at Rodney's tacit approval. I know the man deserved it, he said, but we can't have people going around throwing knights into the moat. It's not diplomatic. Lady Pauline raised one elegant eyebrow. Indeed not, sir, she said. And Halt has been altogether too high-handed about it all, he continued. I'm going to have to speak to him about it, most severely. Someone certainly should, Pauline agreed, and Rodney grunted a reluctant assent. He definitely needs taking in hand. You wanted to see my lord? Said a familiar You wanted to see me, my lord? Oh, sorry. You wanted to see me, my lord? Said a familiar voice, and they all turned guiltily toward the door, which Rodney had left open when he barged in. Halt stood there, clad in his gray and green mottled cloak, his face half hidden in the shadows of the deep cowl. It was uncanny, the Baron thought, how the man could appear almost without a sound. Now Errol, like his two department heads, was conscious that he had been caught talking about Halt behind his back. He flushed in embarrassment, while Sir Rodney cleared his throat noisily. Only Lady Pauline appeared unconcerned, and she had a lifetime of practice at appearing unconcerned. Yes, Halt, of course, come in, won't you? Shut the door behind you, there's a good fellow. As he said these last words, Baron Errol shot a baleful glance at Sir Rodney, who shrugged guiltily. Halt nodded greetings to Lady Pauline and Sir Rodney, and then moved to stand before the Baron's massive desk. There was a long and increasingly awkward silence as the ranger stood waiting. Errol cleared his throat several times, not sure where to begin. Inevitably, it was Lady Pauline who broke the impasse. I imagine you're wondering why the Baron asked to see you, Halt, she said, relieving the tension in the room and forcing Halt to say something, anything, at the same time. The ranger, taciturn as ever, glanced at Pauline, then the Baron, and replied in as few words as possible. Yes, my lord. But it was a start, and now Baron Errol had been given a chance to gather his thoughts and overcome his embarrassment. He brandished the letter in Halt's general direction. This, he managed in time to say. He managed in time not to say brouhaha again. The word was being grossly overused, he thought. This business with Sir Digby, Halt. It's just no good at all. I agree, my lord, Halt said, and the Baron sat back in his chair, a little surprised and quite a bit relieved. You do? He said. Yes, my lord. The man is a nincompoop and a fool. Even worse, he took me for a fool as well. I suppose I can understand that he might want to keep some of his men for the planting season, but to try to hide them in the forest from a ranger? Why, that was a downright insult. The man needed to be taught a lesson. But was it your place to teach him, Halt? The Baron asked. Now Halt raised one eyebrow in reply. I don't recall seeing anyone else prepared to do so, my lord. Perhaps Halt acted in haste, in the heat of the moment, Lady Pauline interjected, trying to give Halt a graceful way out of the situation. But the ranger simply looked at her, then back to the Baron, and said, No, it was pretty well thought through, and I didn't rush at all. I took my time. Lady Pauline shrugged. The Baron's expression showed his exasperation. He would be willing to give Halt some leeway in this matter if the ranger would only allow it, but Halt was obviously determined to be pig-headed. Then there was no mitigating circumstances, Halt, he said firmly. You have acted excessively. I have no choice but to reprimand you. Holt considered the matter before replying. An awkward situation, my lord, since I am not technically answerable to you. I answer to Ranger Command and ultimately to the king. The Baron opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again. Holt was right. As the Ranger attached to Redmont Fife, he was required to cooperate with the Baron, but he was independent of the Baron's authority. That fact and Holt's intentionally unhelpful manner were beginning to get under the Baron's skin. Once again, it was Lady Pauline who suggested a compromise. Perhaps you could inform Holt in an official manner that you are displeased with his actions, she said. The Baron considered the suggestion. It had merit, he thought, but the wording could be a little stronger. Displeased is too mild a word, Pauline. I would rather use the word vexed. I would be most discomforted to know you were vexed, my lord, Holt said, with just the slightest trace of mockery in his tone. The Baron turned a piercing glare at him. Don't take this too far, it warned him. Then we shall make it extremely vexed, Lady Pauline, he said meaningfully. I leave it to you to put it in the right form. He looked from her to Holt. You will receive the official notification of my displeasure tomorrow, Holt. I tremble in anticipation, my lord, said Holt, and the Baron's eyebrows drew together angrily. I think that will be all, Holt, he said, very obviously restraining his temper. Lady Pauline shook her head slightly at Holt's sardonic tone. He was walking a very fine line, she thought. The Ranger now bowed slightly to Baron Erold, turned and left, closing the door quietly behind him. That's the trick of trying to be a little stinker. You got to know when to stop. The Baron let his breath out in an angry sigh. That man is impossible, he said. In all the time I've known him, I've never seen him like this. He's touchy, bad-tempered, sarcastic. What on earth is the matter with him? Sir Rodney shook his head. Like the Baron, he had known Holt for many years and counted him as a friend. Something is obviously bothering him, he said. But what? Perhaps he's lonely, Lady Pauline said thoughtfully, and both men looked at her in amazement. Lonely, Holt? Said Sir Rodney incredulously. Holt's never been lonely in his life. He lives alone. He likes it that way. He did, said Lady Pauline, but things have been different for the past year or so, haven't they? You mean Will? The Baron asked, and she nodded. Think about it. Holt has only ever had 2 apprentices. There was Galan 5 or 6 years ago, and now Will, and he's a rather special young man. The Baron nodded, not sure she was right, but willing to listen. He's that, all right. Lady Pauline was warming to her theme now. He's amusing and interesting and talkative and cheerful. I should imagine he's brightened Holt's life quite considerably. Not only that, Rodney put in, but he saved Holt's life as well. Exactly, said Lady Pauline. There's a very special bond that's developed between those two. Holt has become as much a surrogate father as a mentor to Will, and now he's sent him away. I think he's missing him. He'd never admit it, but I think he's been enjoying having a young person around. She paused to see what the Baron thought. He was nodding agreement. You could be right, Lady Pauline, he said. You could be right. He considered the matter for some seconds and then said thoughtfully, You know, it might be a good idea if you were to have a talk with him. I, my lord? Said Lady Pauline. Why would I have more influence over him than anyone else? Well, said the Baron, I just thought since you and he were once... Something in Lady Pauline's expression stopped him from going further. You know, he finished weakly. I'm afraid I don't, my lord, she said. What is it that I should know? Well, it's just that people have always said, you know, that you and Holt were once... He realized he was floundering and he stopped once more. Lady Pauline was smiling expectantly at him, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. They were like ice. The Baron looked around for help and noticed Sir Rodney. He appealed to him for confirmation. Rodney, you've heard what people say, haven't you? But the Battlemaster was an experienced campaigner, and he knew when a tactical retreat was the wisest choice. I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about, my lord, he said. I never listen to idle gossip. He added a little smugly. Erold shot him a baleful look. Just you wait, it said. Rodney saw it, read the message there, and shrugged. He'd take the Baron's anger over Lady Pauline's any day of the week. A wise policy, Sir Rodney, Lady Pauline told him. Then, turning back to the Baron, she continued, but perhaps I do have a suggestion that might ease the problem with Holt. The Baron seized the lifeline eagerly. That's splendid, my lady, splendid. And in point of fact, that's all I meant when I said that you might have a talk with him. After all, you are a very wise woman, very wise. Lady Pauline hid a smile with some difficulty. For a moment, she played with the idea of teasing him further, pretending to equate wisdom with advancing years. But she felt he had suffered enough. You're too kind, my lord, altogether too kind. The Baron breathed a sigh of relief that the conversation had veered away from the dangerous ground. He had handled it very adroitly, he thought. Women were always susceptible to flattery, after all. So, what is this excellent idea of yours? He said, piling it on a little more. Lady Pauline hesitated just long enough to let him know she could see right through him, and then continued. Well, sir, since Holt is missing his apprentice, I thought we might look at replacing young Will for a week or two. Replace him? Errol said, puzzled. We can hardly give Holt a new apprentice for 2 weeks, my lady. No, my lord, she agreed, but I thought I might lend him one of mine. It was Rodney who was first to see where she was headed. Young Alice, he said, the tall blonde one? Lady Pauline inclined her head in his direction and smiled. Sir Rodney found himself wondering about the rumored relationship between Pauline and Holt. She was tall, elegant, and graceful, and even now that her blonde hair was streaked with gray, she was still an exceptional beauty. Exactly, she said. I mentioned I'm planning to send Alice on her first independent mission. I thought we might ask Holt to escort her. I'm sure his presence would be good for her confidence. Baron Erold was tugging thoughtfully at his short beard. She's a rather solemn lass, isn't she? He asked, but Lady Pauline shook her head. On the contrary, my lord, she has a delightfully dry sense of wit and a beautiful smile. We've been encouraging her to make greater use of it. And do you think a week or so in her company might snap Holt out of his black mood he's in? Well, if he's looking after her, he'll take his mind off his own troubles, Lady Pauline replied. In addition, Alice is young and free-spirited and quite beautiful. I think her company might be enough to cheer up any man, even grim old Holt, she added, smiling. The Baron smiled too. She sounds just like her teacher, he said. This time it was no idle flattery. All right. Back to Will, Horace, and Galan. Boy, that sun is really bright, but... There were no answers to be found in Portelath. The three companions went through the village and found the same signs of sudden departure that they had seen at the border post. There was evidence of some hasty packing, but in the majority of the houses, most of the occupants' possessions were still in place. Everything spoke of a population that had departed in a hurry, taking what they could carry on their backs and little more. Tools, utensils, clothes, furniture, and other personal goods had been left behind. But they could find no clue as to where the people of Portelath had gone, or why they had departed. As full night closed in, Galan finally called an end to the search. They returned to the Riad's house, where they unsaddled the horses and rubbed them down in the shelter of a small porch at the front of the building. They spent an uneasy night in the house. At least Will did, and he assumed Horace was as uncomfortable as he was. Galan, for his part, seemed relatively unperturbed, rolling himself into his cloak and falling instantly asleep when Will relieved him after the first watch. But Galan's manner was more subdued than normal, and Will guessed that the ranger was more concerned by this baffling turn of events than he was letting on. As he stood his watch, Will was amazed at how much noise a house could make. Doors creaked, floors groaned, the ceiling seemed to sigh with every breath of wind outside. And the village itself seemed full of loose items that would bang and clatter as well, bringing Will to a nervous, wide-eyed attention as he sat by the unglazed window in the front room of the house, the wooden shutters hooked back to keep them secure. The moon seemed keen to join in on his subterfuge as well, soaring high above the village and casting deep pools of shadow between the houses of the village. Shadows that seemed to move slightly when they caught sight of them out of the corner of your eye, then stopped as soon as you stared directly at them. More movement came as clouds flew across the face of the moon, alternately causing the main square to be illuminated, then plunged into sudden darkness. Just after midnight, as Galan had predicted, a steady rain set in, and the other noises were joined by the gurgle of running water and the plish-plash-plash of drops falling off eaves and into puddles below. Will woke Horace to take over the watch at around 2 a.m. He piled up a stack of cushions and bed covers on the floor of the main room, wrapped his cloak around him, and lay down. Then he lay awake for another hour and a half, listening to the creaks, the groans, the gurgles, and the splashes, wondering whether Horace had dropped off to sleep, and whether even now some unseen horror was creeping up on the house, bloodthirsty and unstoppable. He was still worrying about it when he finally fell asleep, without noticing that he had done so. You ever have your mind go? Usually it's like if you're kind of home alone, or if it's late, you wake up in the middle of the night. Especially in the winter, I notice the houses crack a little bit more because of the dryness. They were on the road early the next morning. The rain had stopped just before dawn, and Galan was keen to press on to Gwentalath, the first large town on their route, and find some answers to the puzzles that they had found so far in Celtica. They had a quick, cold breakfast of hard bread and dried fruit, washed down with icy water from the village well, and then saddled up and rode out. They wound down the stony path from the village, taking their time on the uneven surface. But when they hit the main road once more, they urged their horses into a canter. They held the canter for 20 minutes and then rested the horses by riding at a walk for the next 20. They maintained this alternating pattern through the morning, and the miles went by steadily. They ate a quick meal in the middle of the day, then rode on. This was the principal mining area of Celtica, and they passed at least a dozen coal or iron mines, large black holes cut into the sides of hills and mountains, surrounded by timber shoring and stone buildings. Nowhere, however, did they see any sign of life. It was as if the inhabitants of Celtica had simply vanished from the face of the earth. "They may have deserted their border posts and even their villages," Galan muttered once, almost to himself. "But I've never yet met a Celt who would desert a mine while there was an ounce of metal still to be torn from it." Eventually, in mid-afternoon, they came over a crest, and there, in a valley dropping away from them, were the neat rows of stone roofs that formed Gwentalath Township. A small spire in the center of the town marked a temple. The Celts had their own unique religion, which had to do with the gods of fire and iron. A large tower formed the main defensive position for the town. They were too far away to make out whether there might be any movement of people in the streets. But, as before, there was no sign of smoke from the chimneys, and even more significantly, according to Galan, no noise. "Noise?" Horace asked. "What kind of noise?" "Banging, hammering, clanking," Galan answered him briefly. "Remember, the Celts don't just mine iron ore, they work the iron as well. With the breeze blowing from the southwest as it is, we should be able to hear the forges at work, even from this distance." "Well, let's go see then," Will said, and began to urge Tug forward. Galan, however, put up a hand to restrain him. "I think perhaps I might go on ahead alone," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving the town and the valley below him. Will looked at him, puzzled. "Alone?" he asked, and Galan nodded. You noted yesterday that we were making ourselves pretty obvious when we rode into Portalath, and you were right. Perhaps it's time we became a little more circumspect. Something is going on, and I'd like to know what it is." Will had to agree that it made sense for Galan to go on alone. After all, he was possibly the best unseen mover in the Ranger Corps, and Rangers were the best unseen movers in the kingdom. Galan motioned for them to fall back from the crest they were standing on, and down the other side to a spot where a small gully formed a sheltered campsite, out of the wind. "Set up camp here," he told them. "No fires. We'll have to stay with cold rations until we know what's going on. I should be back sometime after dark." And with that, he wheeled Blaze and trotted him back over the crest and down the road toward Gwentalath. Will and Horace took a half an hour or so to set up the campsite. There was little to do. They had attached their tarpaulin onto some scrubby bushes growing out of the stone wall of the gully, weighing down the other end with rocks. At least there were plenty of them. This gave them a triangular shelter in case the rain set in again. Then they prepared a fireplace in front of the shelter. Galan had said no fires, but if he arrived back in the middle of the night and changed those orders, they might as well be ready. It took a considerably longer time to stack a supply of firewood. The only real source was the scrubby heather that covered the hillside. The roots and branches of the bush were tough but highly flammable. The two boys hacked out a reasonable supply, Horace using the small hatchet he carried in his pack and Will his sax knife. Eventually, with all their housekeeping taken care of, they sat on either side of the empty fireplace, backs leaned against the rocks. Will spent a few minutes running a sharpening stone over his sax knife, restoring its razor-sharp edge. "I really prefer camping in forest areas." Sorry. There we go. You're going to see a little bit of the pillow. Horace said, shifting his back for the 10th time against the unyielding rock behind him. Will grunted in reply, but Horace was bored and kept on talking, more for the sake of having something to do than because he really wanted to. After all, in a forest you have lots of firewood ready to hand. It just falls out of the trees for you. Not while you wait, Will disagreed. He too was talking more for the sake of it than anything else. No, not while you wait. Usually it's already happened before you arrive, Horace said. Plus, in a forest, you've usually got pine needles or leaves on the ground, and that makes for a softer sleeping place. And there are logs and trees to sit on and lean against, and they have a lot fewer sharp edges than rocks. Again, he wriggled his back to a temporarily more comfortable spot. He glanced up at Will, rather hoping that the apprentice ranger might disagree with him. Then they could argue to pass the time. Will, however, merely grunted again. He inspected the edge of his sax knife, slid the knife into its scabbard, and lay back. Uncomfortable, he sat up again, undid the knife belt, and draped it over his pack, along with his bow and quiver. Then he lay back, his head on a flat piece of stone. He closed his eyes. The sleepless night he had spent had left him drained and flat. Horace sighed to himself, then took out his sword and began honing its edge, quite unnecessarily as it was already razor sharp. But it was something to do. He rasped away, glancing occasionally at Will to see if his friend was asleep. For a moment he thought he was, but then the smaller boy suddenly squirmed around, sat up, and reached for his cloak. Bundling it up, he put it on the flat stone he was using as a headrest, and then lay back down. You're right about forests, he said crankily. Much more comfortable places to camp. Horace said nothing. He decided his sword was sharp enough and slid it back into its oiled leather scabbard, leaning the sheathed weapon against the rock face behind him. He watched Will again as he tried to find a comfortable spot. No matter how he twisted and squirmed, there was always a pebble or a piece of rock poking into his back or side. 5 or 10 minutes passed, and then Horace finally said, Want to practice? It'll pass the time. Will opened his eyes and considered the idea. Reluctantly, he admitted to himself that he was never going to get to sleep on this hard, stony ground. Why not? He rummaged in his pack for his practice weapons, then joined Horace on the far side of the tent where he was scraping a practice circle in the sandy gully floor. The two boys took up their positions, then, at a nod from Horace, they began. Will was improving, but Horace was definitely the master at this exercise. Will couldn't help admiring the speed and balance he showed as he wielded the long stick in a dazzling series of backhands, forehands, side cuts, and overheads. Furthermore, when he knew he had beaten Will's defensive posture, he would at the last moment hold back from whacking him. Instead, he would lightly touch the spot where his blow would have fallen to demonstrate the point. He didn't do it with any sense of superiority either. Weapons practice, even with wooden weapons, was a serious part of Horace's life nowadays. It wasn't something to crow about when you were better than your opponent. Horace had learned only too well in dozens of practice bouts at the battle school that it never paid to underestimate an opponent. Instead, he used his superior ability to help Will, showing him how to anticipate strokes, teaching him the basic combinations that all swordsmen used and the best way to defeat them. As Will ruefully acknowledged, knowing how to do it was one thing. Actually doing it was an entirely different manner. He realized how much his former enemy had matured and wondered if the same changes were evident in himself. He didn't think so. He didn't feel any different, and whenever he saw himself in a mirror, he didn't seem to look any different either. Your left hand is dropping too far, Horace pointed out as they paused between bouts. I know, Will said. I'm expecting a side cut and I want to be ready for it. Horace shook his head. That's all very well, but if you drop it too far, it's easy for me to feign a side cut, then swing up into an overhand. See? He showed Will the action he was describing, beginning the sword in a wide sideways sweep and then with a powerful wrist movement, taking it up into a high swinging downward stroke. He stopped the wooden blade a few inches from Will's head, and the ranger apprentice saw that his counterstroke would have been far too late. Sometimes I think I'll never learn these things, he said. Horace patted him encouragingly on the shoulder. Are you kidding? He asked. You're improving every day, and besides, I could never shoot or use those throwing knives the way you do. Even while they had been on the road, Galan had insisted that Will practice his ranger skills as often as was practical. Horace had been impressed, to say the least, when he had seen how adept the smaller boy had become. Several times he had shuddered when he thought what might happen if he had to face an archer such as Will. His accuracy with the bow was uncanny as far as Horace was concerned. He knew that Will could place arrows into every gap in his armor if he chose. even in the narrow visor slit of a full-face jousting helmet. What he didn't appreciate was that Will's accuracy was nothing more than average as far as ranger standards were considered. "Let's try it again," Will suggested wearily. But another voice interrupted them. "Let's not, little boys. Let's put down our nasty sharp sticks and stand very still, shall we?" The two apprentices whirled around at the words. There, at the mouth of the small U-shaped gully where they had built their camp, stood two ragged-looking figures. Both were heavily bearded and unkempt, and both were dressed in a strange mixture of clothing, some of it tattered and threadbare, while some items were new and obviously very costly. The taller of the two wore a richly brocaded satin vest, but it was thick with dirt. The other sported a scarlet hat with a bedraggled feather in it. He also carried an iron-spiked wooden club, holding it in a hand that was swathed in a dirty bandage. His companion had a long sword, jagged and nicked along the edges. He flourished it now at the boys. "Come on now, you boys. Sharp sticks are dangerous for the likes of you," he said, and let go a hoarse guttural laugh. Will's hands dropped automatically to reach for the sack's knife, encountering nothing. With a sinking feeling, he realized that his knife, belt, bow, and quiver were all neatly piled on the far side of the fireplace where he had been sitting. The two intruders would stop him before he could reach them. He cursed himself for his carelessness. Halt would be furious, he thought. Then, looking at the sword and club, he realized that Halt's annoyance might be the least of his worries. Uh-oh. I wonder who those people are. I guess we'll find out tomorrow.